a critical pedagogy, a social consciousness. I'd like to begin my presentation in thinking about Paulo Friere and his and how he became the essence or the forefather of the idea of critical pedagogy, and how he became a critical pedagogue. I think it starts in essence as his childhood. In my research, I found that as a young student, he fell behind as many as 4 grades behind in his studies, and a lot of that he credits to his impoverished background, his poverty, and really hunger. That because he was hungry, he had a hard time concentrating in his classes, and that his social condition actually hurt his ability to have an education. And I think it is with this basis, at this hunger for food, and then ultimately this hunger for knowledge, that we begin to think about how he came to construct this idea of critical pedagogy. I think it starts with a curious self. For those of us that want to prescribe to this notion, is that curiosity, be it in our youth and even as we grow older, is a huge part of doing a good job at this. We search for answers, particularly the big question of why. Why is our world constructed as it is? Why do socioeconomic issues that we know exist? Why is power distributed as it is and wealth distributed as it is? And ultimately, how do we help build community in the face of these constructs? One of the major virtues of Mr. Friere's work comes from the idea of tolerance, of having an open mind to new people, to new environments, and to new ideas. To actually, as a teacher, create environments that allow all participants, including ourselves, to partake in this learning environment, that we all can grow from the interaction with each other. And then ultimately that we have a duty to educate the oppressed. Okay? In his own work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Mr. Friere states, "No pedagogy which is truly liberating can remain distant from the oppressed by treating them as unfortunates and by presenting for their emulations models from among the oppressors. The oppressed must be their own example in the struggle for their own redemption." We want to help them to develop a voice. The oppressed must learn to communicate in the dominant syntax so that their voice can be heard as they fight the injustices of their own existence. We as teachers can help to construct this voice by presenting humility, by letting them know no one knows it all and no one is ignorant to everything. We've got to break down this idea of authoritarianism and let them know that there is some equal footing between both teacher and student. We've got to show courage, the courage to fight, the courage to love. Lovingness to the profession, showing our own enthusiasm, showing our lovingness to our students, and again, offering an example of the joy of living. That example can be contemplative, that we can show our students that we are curious ourselves, that the joy of living is really born out of that idea, the joy of growth. As we think about, or as I think about critical pedagogy, how do we put it into action? I think there's 4 tenets that we must keep in mind. The first being dialogue. Okay, getting back to humility, we want to discuss with our students. We want to look at the learning process as a two-way street where teacher serves as a student and a student serves as the teacher. We want to position education as not one person acting upon another, but actually people working together. To debunk the idea of banking, that students are an empty account that need to be filled by the teacher. Interaction is the key component at the beginning of critical pedagogy. The second idea is this idea of praxis, this informed action. We want to empower our students to think critically, to act justly. One of my favorite ideas coming out of the Jesuit idea is we want to be contemplatives in action. Contemplatives in action. Not only thinking and arguing, but working and acting for justice and for change. Thirdly, we want our students to think about consciousness, developing a sense of social structure that surrounds us, and understand that the power that we have to transform reality, to be within our own self, to understand that our actions, when acted justly, can create change in the world that we live in. And lastly, we want to create a lived experience. We want to inhabit the culture as teachers. We want to validate the situation of our students. We want to build self-awareness, build self-esteem, and as one of my favorite ideas, again, coming back from the Jesuits, from our patron saint, St. Ignatius of Loyola, is this idea that once we are affirmed, once we are learned, that then we can go out and we can set the world on fire. One of the questions that was asked in this idea or in this project was, is it possible to be neutral in teaching? All right, and I want to quote a quote that I got from Richard Shaw. He states in the book, Adult Education, Possibility for Transformative Action. He says, there is no such thing as neutral education process. Education either functions as an instrument, which is used to facilitate the integration of generations into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity to it, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically with reality and discover how to participate in a transformation of their world. When I read this, I think to myself, why would we want to be neutral? We want our students to develop a critical lens, even if it's turned towards us as teachers. We want our students to grow to be the best selves they can be. We want them to grow their opinions, to become impassioned, and motivate them into action. And I think that is determined, again, by us as teachers being courageous enough to show what we want our students to know that we believe as truth, and then allow them to examine it, break it down, and even in the midst of it all, possibly disagree with us. When I think about how I bring in critical pedagogy into my discussions into my class, I think of 3 examples. Just recently, my students and I critically broke down the ideology of both Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Both of these men at the turn of the 19th century were instrumental in trying to create how do African Americans find safe havens in the U.S. United States community. That included Booker T. Washington, who believed that it was vocational, that African Americans had to build up their skills, build up their economic well-being, and therefore then would be felt as full citizens here in the U.S. Whereas W.E.B. argued that it was through higher education and this development of the talented 10th that the African American could then demand for his equal rights as it relates to the United States. Another ideology that I see and have used in my econ class is the juxtaposition of the idea of capitalism depicted by by the picture on Wall Street and the triumphant arms up, this pursuit for the mighty dollar, versus the Occupy Wall Street movement that we currently see taking place all across our country as people become disenfranchised and disillusioned by our current economic situation. Here you can see the young protester, actually Anne Hathaway, showing a poster talking about blackboards, not banks. In other words, let's invest in education and not into this capitalistic idea as it relates to finance. Lastly, just recently, I asked my students to juxtaposition Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King, and I wanted them to tell me what they knew, to educate me as to how they see both of those very important historical figures as it relates to African American history. And what I've got here is a couple screenshots of my blackboard as it relates to what my students thought about Malcolm X and what they thought about Martin Luther King. In these cases, these were discussions, dialogues, and I allowed the students to start to create their reality of the truth, helping them guide them, letting them know where my ideology is, but letting them know that I don't have all the answers and that they can discover their own truths with their own analysis. Lastly, when I start to think a little bit about some of the triumphs that I think I've had in using critical pedagogy, the first thing that comes to mind is my ability to be the proctor for our African American Student Association. Depicted here is a black fist, that we wanted to have put on our T-shirts to symbolize our group and our club on campus. Unfortunately, our administration at the initial thought of this felt like that our vision was too militant, and at first denied our students the ability to use this as the symbol for our club. I empowered our students and talked to them about how that they want to go out presenting that this fist, a symbol of Black power, is more of Black unity, about Black growth, versus a Black power idea that is anti-establishment or anti-American culture. We are currently in the middle of creating this presentation, and I do believe we're going to be successful and hope that we're successful in overcoming what I believe was a short-sighted ideology from our administration. And lastly, maybe one of my most favorite triumphs as it relates to this was my ability to participate with a group of students and go down to New Orleans post-Katrina and work for a week in a social setting. I think in this case, what we did was that we had a lived experience. A bunch of us, 40 young men, 5 teachers, went to New Orleans for a week, and we inhabited that situation. We saw the destruction of Hurricane Katrina. We rubbed elbows with those that were directly hit by this major catastrophe, and then we got our hands dirty and helped them try to rebuild and clean up their city. I saw young men who I knew in my campus life who came across as, at times, apathetic, become moved by the situation, to become aware of the situation, to see justice and the injustice of this situation, to be emblazoned, to have their heart inflamed, and to go to work. I believe when it's all said and done, what we want to do when we think about critical pedagogy is create an environment in which our students are acquire their own knowledge of the situation and become empowered to fight against the situation and to be put into action to be agents of change.